Bram Calder didn't knock. He never did. The door swung open hard enough to bang against the wall, and he walked into Elowen Voss's cabin like he already owned it, because, in his mind, he already did. 3 of his ranch hands stood outside. She could see their shadows through the window. He dropped a folded paper on her table without looking at her. "Sign it," he said. "I'm being generous." Elowen looked at the number written on that paper. Then she looked up at him. "Get out of my house." Calder smiled. The slow, patient smile of a man who had never once been told no and made to live with it. "You've got 2 children, no water, and ground that'll crack your plow by April." He picked the paper back up and held it in front of her face. "Sign it, Mrs. Voss, before this land takes something from you that you can't get back." She didn't sign it. What happened next? What she did instead is the reason people in Ashwater Crossing still talk about that summer. If this story stays with you, consider subscribing to this channel so you never miss what comes next. These are the kinds of stories worth sitting with, the ones that ask you quietly, what would you do? Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The wagon arrived on a Tuesday, which nobody in Ashwater Crossing would have remembered, except that the woman driving it was alone. Not alone in the way widows sometimes arrived with a brother or a father-in-law riding alongside. Alone in the real sense. 2 children on the bench beside her, a boy of 11 with a serious face, and a girl of 7 who kept leaning out to look at things. And that was the entirety of her company. The wagon was loaded with what appeared to be everything she owned in the world, which wasn't much. A trunk, some tools, a crate that clinked when the wheels hit ruts, a rolled canvas that could have been a tent or a tarp or both. Elowen Voss drove that wagon through the middle of town without stopping. She had directions written on a folded piece of paper tucked inside her coat, and she followed them without asking anyone for help. People on the main street watched her go past. A few nodded. Most just watched. Harlan Pruitt, who ran the feed store and considered himself a reliable judge of character, watched from his doorway and said to nobody in particular, "She won't last the summer." The woman on the wagon didn't hear him, or if she did, she gave no sign. She kept driving on. The homestead she had purchased sight unseen, a decision that haunted her the moment she saw it, sat on a gentle slope about 4 miles east of town. 120 acres, the deed said. What the deed did not say was that the cabin's roof sagged on one side like a tired old man's shoulder, that the well had gone dry sometime in the last several years, that the creek marked on the property map had apparently decided to stop existing, and that the soil in what should have been the east field had cracked into a pattern that reminded Elowen, unpleasantly, of old pottery left too long in the sun. She sat on the wagon bench for a long moment after she pulled the horse to a stop. Tobin, beside her, said nothing. He was 11 and old enough to understand that sometimes silence was the only appropriate response to a situation. Maisie, who was 7 and did not yet understand this, said, "Is this it?" "This is it," Elowen said. "It needs work," Maisie said. "Yes. A lot of work." Maisie. "Sorry." Elowen climbed down from the wagon. Her boots hit the ground, and the dry soil puffed up around them like flour. She stood there looking at the cabin for a long moment, at the sagging roof, the gap where a shutter had come loose and hung by a single hinge, the dark water stain along one wall that suggested the roof's problems were not recent. She felt something move through her chest. Not despair exactly. Something harder than despair. Something that tasted like the moment before a decision. She picked up the nearest crate and carried it toward the door. Oh. Her husband, Clement Voss, had died 14 months earlier. He had been 41 years old and apparently healthy, and then one morning he simply hadn't gotten up, and by afternoon the doctor was shaking his head with the particular expression doctors used when they had no answer to give you. "Heart," the doctor said. Could have happened any time, could have happened years from now, no way to know. Clement had left her 2 children, a small insurance policy that covered his debts and almost nothing else, and a letter, written years before, she suspected, during some middle-of-the-night moment of worry, that described, in his careful handwriting, the piece of land in Nebraska that he'd been watching. Land prices there were still manageable, soil could be worked. Water was findable, he'd written, if you knew where to look. He had written it as a dream. She was converting it into a plan because she had no other plan available. She had $41 left after the land purchase and the journey. $41, 2 children, a broken-down homestead, and ground that was trying to tell her, in the clearest possible language, that it was not interested in being farmed. That was what she had. She set the crate down inside the cabin, turned around, went back to the wagon, and got the next one. The neighbors arrived on the 3rd day. Elowen had expected this. In small communities, newcomers always attracted attention. What she had not quite anticipated was the texture of the attention. A woman named Dora Fitch came first, ostensibly to welcome her, bringing a jar of preserves that Elowen accepted with genuine gratitude. But Dora Fitch's eyes moved around the inside of the cabin with the specific, careful focus of someone collecting information to share later, and when she said, "You must be so brave coming all this way by yourself," her tone made the word brave sound remarkably like the word foolish. "I didn't have many choices," Elowen said, which was true. "Of course," Dora said. "And your figure—" She paused. "The farm work here is quite demanding. Physically, I mean. Nebraska isn't gentle on people." Elowen looked at her. "Thank you for the preserves," she said. Dora left. Elowen set the jar on the shelf and stood looking at it for a moment, jaw tight, and then she turned and went back to work. She had learned, sometime in the last 14 months of managing everything alone, that the most powerful response to a certain kind of comment was silence followed by action. People who expected you to collapse were always slightly disoriented when you didn't. She had found that disorientation useful. What? The well was the first real crisis. She'd known the existing well was dry. What she hadn't known was how dry. When Tobin lowered a rope with a rag tied to the end of it, his idea, which she'd noted with quiet pride, the rag came back up bone dry from a depth of 30 feet. Whatever water table had once fed this well had either dropped significantly or moved. She went into town to find a well driller. His name was August Farrell, and he was a lean, weathered man in his 60s who had drilled more wells in this part of Nebraska than he could count. He came out and walked the property with her, prodding the ground occasionally with a long metal rod, looking at the slope of the land, looking at the dry creek bed. "Not impossible," he said finally, which was not the encouraging statement it might have sounded like. "What would it cost?" Elowen asked. He named a number. She kept her face still. "That's assuming we find anything at a reasonable depth," he added. "If we have to go deep—" He named a higher number. She did the arithmetic in her head. Either number was catastrophic. The higher number was impossible. "I see," she said. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who recognized a bad situation but couldn't do anything about it. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Voss. If you can get together the fee, I'll do the work. But I won't drill for free, and I can't promise what I'll find." She thanked him and drove the wagon back to the homestead. She sat in the cabin that night after the children were asleep, at the table with the lantern burning low, and she looked at the numbers she'd written on a piece of paper. Her money, her costs, what she owed to the property tax already accruing. What seed would cost if she could find the water to make seed worth buying? The numbers did not add up. They did not come close to adding up. She sat there a long time. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie in that particular Nebraska way, not gusting, just a steady pressure, like the land was breathing. Somewhere in the distance, something rustled in the dry grass. She did not know yet what she was going to do, but she was not going to leave. She folded the paper. She turned down the lantern. She went to bed. Bram Calder showed up on a Friday morning, 9 days after she arrived. She was outside, assessing the creek bed, trying to understand why it was dry, whether it was seasonal or permanent, tracing the line of it with her eyes up the gentle slope to where it curved behind the property line. When she heard horses. Not one. Several. She turned. 4 riders. The man in front was large, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in a way that was meant to be noticed, riding a horse that cost more than her wagon. He had a face that had been handsome once and had curdled somewhat with age and confidence into something harder to name. His eyes found her immediately and stayed there with an evaluating quality, like he was assessing livestock. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. She had already heard the name Bram Calder from 3 different people in town, each time with a slightly different quality of wariness. "Mrs. Voss," he said, without dismounting. "Mr. Calder," she said. He looked at the dry creek bed. He looked at the cabin. He looked at her. And she recognized that look, had seen it on Dora Fitch's face, had seen it in the eyes of half the people she'd passed on the main street. The particular calculation of someone deciding what you were worth based on what they could see. "I'll make you a fair offer for this property," he said. He named a number. It was low. She didn't know land prices well yet, but she knew instinctively it was low, in the same way you know a scale is rigged before you've finished stepping onto it. "You've got no water, Mrs. Voss. Without water, this ground is decorative. You've got 2 children to think about." "I appreciate your concern," she said. Her voice was level. "No." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like the recalibration of a man who had anticipated a certain sequence of events and found it interrupted. "You don't want to think on it a few days?" "No." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin, the dry ground, the failed creek, and he looked back at her with an expression that had settled into something patient and certain. "The offer won't improve," he said. "I understand," she said. He turned the horse and rode back the way he'd come, his men following. She watched them go. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the particular exertion of holding herself completely still while every part of her wanted to move. She turned back to the creek bed. She was still looking at it when Tobin came up beside her. "Who was that?" he asked. "Our neighbor," she said. "He didn't seem friendly." "No," she agreed. "He didn't." Sella Wren was not easy to find. Several people in town mentioned her name when Elowen asked about the land, about water, about the history of the property. And the name always came with a slight hesitation, as if people weren't quite sure how to categorize her. She was old. She had been in the area longer than almost anyone. She lived several miles out from the main settlement on a small piece of ground that somehow, mysteriously, always seemed to produce a decent garden. Elowen went to find her on a Wednesday afternoon, leaving Tobin with instructions and taking Maisie with her because Maisie was too young to be left alone and too energetic to be useful at the homestead without direct supervision. Sella Wren was in her garden when they arrived. She was a small woman, nearly folded in half by age, with hands that looked like they'd been working soil since before Elowen was born. She looked up when the wagon stopped and did not seem surprised to see a stranger. "Mrs. Voss," she said, though Elowen hadn't introduced herself. "You know who I am." "Word moves fast," Sella said. She straightened up, or as straight as she could get, and looked at Elowen with a directness that was neither rude nor warm, just attentive. "You're the widow who bought the Harston place, the one with the dry well." "Yes," Elowen said. "What do you want to know?" Elowen explained the situation, the well, August Farrell's estimate, the cost she couldn't meet, the creek that no longer ran. She spoke plainly, without self-pity, because she had found that self-pity was a thing people used to dismiss you. Sella listened without interrupting. When Elowen finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're looking in the wrong direction." "What?" "You keep talking about digging down." Sella tilted her head toward the sky. Not dramatically, just a small gesture. "Start by paying attention to up." Elowen waited for her to explain. "Rain falls on your property same as everywhere else," Sella said. "But your ground is baked hard. When rain hits it, it doesn't sink in. It runs off, follows the slope, goes somewhere else. Someone else's advantage." She looked at Elowen steadily. "You're not missing water. You're letting water leave." Elowen drove home thinking about that. She turned it over in her mind the whole 4 miles. The slope of her property, the direction of the natural drainage, the way the dry creek curved. She thought about the difference between where the water was going and where it could go. She found the journal that night. It was in the trunk that had belonged to Clement's father, a trunk she'd hauled across 3 states mostly because it had felt wrong to leave it behind, though she'd never gone through it systematically. She was looking for a particular tool she thought might be stored in the bottom, and instead she found, beneath 2 layers of folded fabric, a slim book bound in cloth that had once been dark green. She sat down on the cabin floor and opened it. It was a farming journal. Clement's grandfather, she realized from the handwriting style and the dates, written in the 1850s in a part of the country that got less rain than people had expected. The old man had been experimenting, trying things. Some of them hadn't worked. He wrote about those plainly. But near the middle of the journal, several pages described something he called a contour ditch, a curved trench that followed the natural shape of sloped land, slowing runoff, forcing water to spread out and soak in rather than rushing away. He had drawn a diagram. She studied it a long time. She thought about what Sella Wren had said about paying attention to up. She thought about the slope of her property, the angle of the natural drainage, the direction runoff would travel in a storm. She picked up a pencil and paper and began sketching what she understood. Somewhere around midnight, something clicked into place. She sat very still. The well driller had been trying to reach water that was already deep underground. But what if there was a way to bring water closer? What if, instead of chasing what was buried, she could redirect what fell from the sky, store it, slow it, sink it into the soil near where she needed it? It wasn't a certain plan. It wasn't even a proven one. The journal described success, but it also described failures, and she was working with information that was nearly 40 years old on ground she'd known for less than 2 weeks. But it was a plan. She went to bed at midnight, which was the latest she'd been awake since before Clement died. She lay in the dark and thought about curves and slopes and rainwater and soil, and the thought she fell asleep to was this. She didn't need to defeat the prairie. She needed to understand it. The next morning, she began planning. She spent 2 days walking the property with a long level she found in the barn, a beautiful old instrument in a wooden case, probably left by the previous owner, more valuable to her right now than anything else on the land. She found the natural contour lines. She traced where water would flow in a heavy rain. She noted the lowest depression on the east side of the property, where runoff from 3 directions naturally converged before flowing out under the fence toward Calder's Range. That convergence point. That was where she needed to build. She explained it to Tobin, who listened with the intense, focused attention he brought to everything practical. When she finished, he said, "How long will the digging take?" "I don't know," she said. "Can we afford to spend time digging instead of planting?" She looked at him, 11 years old, asking the exact right question. She felt the weight of it. "If we plant without water," she said carefully, "and the summer is dry, we lose everything we planted. If we dig this trench and I'm right about how it works, we have a chance. If I'm wrong—" She stopped. "I'd rather be wrong about something I chose than right about something I gave up on." Tobin looked at the land for a long moment. "Okay," he said. He pulled his small notebook from his pocket. He had been keeping notes on everything since they arrived, measurements and observations, because that was the kind of boy he was. "Tell me what you need me to measure." She bought the shovels on her next trip to town. 2 good ones, plus a mattock for the hard clay. She bought them from the hardware store run by a man named George Pell, who watched her load the tools into the wagon with visible curiosity. "What's all this for?" he asked. She considered how much to say. "Earthwork," she said. She paid, loaded the wagon, and drove back. What she didn't see as she pulled away from the hardware store was George Pell leaning in his doorway and watching her go with a thoughtful expression, the kind that meant he was already calculating what he'd say to the next person who walked through his door. By the time she was halfway home, the information was already moving through Ashwater Crossing. She didn't know that yet. She was thinking about the angle of the slope. She was thinking about how deep she'd need to go before the clay turned to something that would hold water without cracking. She was thinking about all the things that could go wrong. She was also thinking, quietly, in the back of her mind where she kept the things she didn't say out loud, that this was the first time since Clement died that she had felt something that resembled forward motion. It wasn't happiness. She wasn't sure what it was. She drove the wagon through the afternoon light, toward the land that needed her to understand it, and she did not look back at the town she was leaving behind. She had work to do. She started digging on a Monday. There was no ceremony to it. She woke before the children, pulled on her work clothes, the heavy canvas trousers she'd bought secondhand in the last town, a shirt that had been Clement's, worn thin at the elbows, laced up her boots, picked up the mattock, and walked out into the gray pre-dawn light to the place she'd marked with 3 sticks driven into the ground. The mark was the beginning of the curve. She'd spent the better part of Sunday afternoon walking the line she'd planned, adjusting for a slight rise she hadn't noticed on her initial survey, moving one of the sticks 6 feet west after standing at the far end of the line and sighting down it with the level. When she was satisfied, she'd driven the sticks in hard and gone back to the cabin to cook supper. Now she stood at the first stick, looked down the line of them, and swung the mattock. The sound it made when it hit the earth was not encouraging. A hard, flat crack. Not the thud of something giving way, but the sound of something resisting. The clay here was baked deep, dried by weeks without rain into a consistency closer to ceramic than soil. The mattock bounced back at her with a vibration that ran all the way up her forearms and into her shoulders. She swung it again and again. By the time the sun was fully up and Maisie came outside to tell her that Tobin had made porridge, Elowen had dug approximately 8 inches down and 4 feet along the line. Her hands were already telling her they were going to have opinions about this. She ate breakfast standing up. She went back and kept digging. By the end of the first week, she had a trench roughly 40 feet long and 2 feet deep. Her hands had blistered, then the blisters had torn, then they had begun the slower process of toughening. She wrapped them each morning with strips of cloth she'd cut from an old flour sack, and by midday the cloth was usually stiff with dried blood and sweat, and she would re-wrap them at noon when she stopped to eat and water the horse. Tobin walked the line each evening after his own chores were finished, measuring the depth at intervals with a stick he'd marked in inches, writing the numbers in his notebook in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting. He never commented on how slow the progress was. She was grateful for that. Maisie had decided that the trench was interesting and spent a significant portion of her time sitting at the edge of it asking questions. Why does it have to curve? Because the land curves, Elowen said, not stopping. If the trench were straight, the water would build up speed and break through. The curve slows it down. Oh. A pause. Mama, your hands look bad. They're fine. They don't look fine. Maisie. Sorry. She wasn't entirely wrong. Elowen's hands were not fine. They hurt in a consistent, grinding way that had stopped feeling acute and had settled into something she simply worked around, like a persistent noise you stop consciously hearing, but that's still there. She'd stopped mentioning it to herself, which she recognized as either resilience or stubbornness, and wasn't entirely sure which. It was Dora Fitch who first used the phrase. Elowen heard it secondhand from the woman who ran the small dry goods counter at the back of Pell's hardware store, a quiet woman named Ruthie, who seemed constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, though she delivered it with a kind of helpless apology, as though the words escaped her against her will. People have started calling it the Fool's Trench, Ruthie said, while counting out the nails Elowen had come to buy. She said it quickly, not meeting Elowen's eyes. I thought you should know, since folks are saying it. Dora Fitch started it, I think, but it's been... She made a small gesture with her hand that meant it's all over town now. Elowen looked at the nails. She needed them for a repair on the barn roof. She counted them herself to make sure the count was right. Thank you, Ruthie, she said. She paid. She left. In the wagon on the way home, she thought about Dora Fitch, who had come to her cabin with preserves and left with material for a story. She thought about the particular energy of people who watched others attempt difficult things and found ways to preemptively explain why failure was inevitable. She had encountered this energy before. There was something almost eager in it, an investment in the outcome that had nothing to do with the actual person trying. She pulled into the homestead, unhitched the horse, put the nails in the barn, and picked up the mattock. The trench wasn't going to dig itself. The second week was harder than the first. This surprised her, because she had expected it to become easier as she adjusted. What she hadn't anticipated was the way sustained physical labor at the edge of your capacity accumulates, not just in the body, but in the mind. By the 10th day, she was waking at night with her shoulders aching in a way that made sleep thin and unreliable. And by morning, the effort of simply getting up and pulling on boots felt like its own small battle. She won the battle every morning, but it was a battle. What kept her moving, on the mornings when moving felt genuinely impossible, was less about determination, which is a word that makes things sound cleaner than they are, and more about arithmetic. She had no other plan. The money she had would not stretch to a well. Without water, nothing would grow. Without a crop, she could not pay the property tax that would come due in November, and without paying the tax, the land was not hers. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving, dig or lose. So she dug. Tobin began helping on the 14th day, after his chores were done in the afternoon. He was not as strong as an adult, but he was methodical and he didn't quit, and his company during the late afternoon hours mattered more to her than she told him. They worked mostly in silence, which with Tobin was companionable rather than uncomfortable. He was a boy who'd learned early that silence could be a form of respect. One afternoon, about an hour into their working side by side, he said, without looking up from where he was shoveling loosened clay out of the trench, "How deep does it need to be?" 3 feet minimum, she said, more in the lower section, where we need to hold the most water. And the berm? She'd explained the berm to him from the journal, the wall of earth piled on the downhill side of the trench that would hold the captured water in place and force it to soak in rather than run off. 3 feet high, she said, packed tight. We'll need to compact it in layers. He nodded, still shoveling. Then, "Mama, do you think it'll work?" She stopped digging. She stood up straight, one hand on the mattock handle, and looked at him. This serious-faced boy who asked direct questions and expected direct answers and had not once, in the 14 months since his father died, allowed himself to fall apart in front of her, though she knew he fell apart in private because she could hear him sometimes through the thin cabin wall. "I think it could work," she said. "I think the logic is right. I can't promise the land will cooperate." He considered this. "But the logic is right." "Yes." He went back to shoveling. "Okay," he said. That was all. But something in the way he said it, the way he accepted uncertainty and kept working, made her throat tight in a way she didn't entirely understand. Bram Calder came back on a Thursday morning in the 4th week, and this time he didn't bother with the pretense of coming to the door. He rode straight out to where she was working. She heard the horse and looked up, and there he was, sitting his expensive animal at the edge of the field with 2 men behind him, looking down at the trench with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "What in the hell is that?" It wasn't really a question. It was the sound a man makes when he sees something that doesn't fit any category he has prepared. "Earthwork," Elowen said. She was aware that she'd used the same word with George Pell at the hardware store, and she felt a brief private satisfaction at its continued usefulness. Calder looked at the trench at the 40-some-odd feet she'd already completed, curving across the field in the arc she'd planned from the contour lines. And then he looked at her. She was dirty, sweating, standing in the trench itself with clay on her boots and her work shirt plastered to her back, and she did not move to climb out. "You're digging a ditch," he said, "instead of planting." "Correct. Planting season's already running short." "I'm aware." He looked at the 2 men behind him. One of them, a young ranch hand with a broad, sunburned face, let out a short, low sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. "Mrs. Voss," Calder said, and his voice had acquired that patient quality again, the one she'd heard the first time he came. "I will tell you plainly. The community has noticed your—" he glanced at the trench. "Project. People are talking. When a widow with 2 children spends her planting weeks digging holes instead of farming, it raises questions about judgment." Elowen looked at him. "And what are your questions?" she said. Something moved in his face. She had surprised him again. He kept expecting her to be defensive, and she kept refusing to perform it. "My question," he said slowly, "is whether you've thought seriously about what happens in August, when your neighbors have crops and you have an empty field and a very large ditch." "I've thought about August," she said. And I appreciate your concern." She picked up the mattock. "Good morning, Mr. Calder." He stayed for another moment. She could feel him there, the presence of a man trying to decide whether he'd been dismissed or had simply run out of things to say. And then she heard the horse shift and turn, and the sound of hooves moving away. She drove the mattock into the clay. She did not watch him go. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't find out until Ruthie at the hardware store told her, with that same quality of helpless confession, was that Calder had stopped on the way back through town and spoken to 3 men outside the post office for nearly 20 minutes, and that whatever he'd said had made them laugh loud enough that people inside the building had heard it through the walls. The Fool's Trench. The phrase was everywhere now. People said it with a range of inflections, some amused, some genuinely baffled, some with an edge of contempt that was specifically aimed at the idea that a woman of her size could perform this kind of sustained labor. That last one she felt differently than the others. The others she could absorb and put aside. That last one sat differently in her chest, with a slow burn that she recognized as the kind of anger that was either going to destroy you or make you very, very effective, depending on what you did with it. She decided what to do with it. She dug faster. The trench was 70 feet long by the end of the 5th week, and something had changed in how Elowen moved through the day. The soreness had not gone away. She didn't think it was going to go away until she stopped, and she wasn't stopping. But it had settled into her body differently, less like an obstacle, and more like a constant companion she'd learned to work alongside. Her grip on the mattock handle had become automatic. She could read the clay now, knew when a layer was going to be hard and when it would loosen, knew when to swing high and when to chip along the horizontal. She was learning the land the way you learn anything, by doing it wrong enough times to understand what right felt like. On a Wednesday afternoon in the 6th week, she hit something different. She was working the lower section of the trench, with the deepest point where she'd planned for the water to gather, when the mattock struck a layer that didn't crack. It gave. Not much. But instead of the flat resistance of baked clay, there was a slight softness underneath, a texture that her hands read as different before her brain had processed why. She crouched down, pressed her fingers into the bottom of the trench. The soil there was cooler, not dramatically, not wet, but measurably cooler than the surrounding clay, the kind of difference that meant something was different below. She stayed crouched for a while, pressing her hand flat against the bottom of the trench, trying to understand what she was feeling. Then she stood up and kept working. She didn't say anything to the children yet. She wasn't sure enough. But that night, she opened the old journal to the pages she'd read a dozen times now and read them again. And she found the passage where Clement's grandfather had written about what he called a weak seam, a thin layer of water-bearing material too shallow and fragile to feed a proper well, but capable of responding to pressure from above. He had written that in dry country, these seams were often the difference between making it and not, and that the trick was not to dig down to them, but to encourage water from above to reach them. She read it twice. Then she put the journal down and sat in the dark for a while, thinking. The bottom of the trench was cooler. The first major storm arrived on a Saturday night, in the 7th week. She heard it coming before it arrived. The pressure drop that made her ears feel strange, the particular quality of stillness that preceded a serious Nebraska thunderstorm, the way the wind died first and then came back from a different direction entirely. She got both children into the cabin, checked that the horse was secure in the barn, and then stood in the doorway watching the sky go green, dark in the west. Maisie pressed against her side, and Elowen put her arm around her daughter's shoulders without looking down. "Is it going to be bad?" Maisie asked. "It's going to rain," Elowen said. "A lot of rain. That's what we need." "But the trench isn't finished." "No," Elowen agreed. "It isn't." The trench was 80% done. The berm was built along the completed sections, but not the last 20 feet, where the earthen wall had only been roughed in. She had spent the last 2 days trying to move faster, knowing from the color of the evening sky and the way the air smelled that weather was coming. She hadn't moved fast enough. The storm hit at 9 in the evening. She had never heard rain that loud. It came down not like rain, but like something solid, hammering the cabin roof with such force that she and the children could barely hear each other. Maisie climbed into bed with Tobin, and they lay there together with the quilt pulled up while lightning turned the world white through the small window every few minutes, and the thunder came right behind it, close enough to feel in her chest. Elowen sat at the table with the lantern turned low and tried not to think about the unfinished section of berm. She failed. Around midnight, there was a sound outside that she couldn't immediately identify. Not the storm, something else, a lower sound beneath the rain's roar. She stood up. She looked toward the east field. She couldn't see anything in the dark and the rain. She put on her coat. "Mama?" Tobin said from the bed. "Stay inside," she said. "Mama?" "Tobin." She looked at him. "Stay with your sister." She went out. The rain hit her like a wall of cold water. Within 3 steps, she was soaked completely through, her coat doing nothing because the rain was coming from every direction at once, straight down and blown sideways by the gusting wind. She moved toward the field, toward the trench, and the ground under her boots was already saturated, water running over the surface of the clay in shallow sheets that caught the lightning flashes and glittered briefly. She found the trench by nearly falling into it. She caught herself at the edge, crouching, and looked down. The trench was working. Along the finished sections, water was filling the curve in exactly the way she'd planned, spreading into the berm and pressing against the packed earth and soaking down. She could see it even in the dark. The glitter of moving water, the way it was slowing and spreading rather than rushing. But at the unfinished section, in the last 20 feet where the berm was only roughed in, the water was tearing through. She stood there in the roaring rain watching a section of her 7 weeks of work collapsing under the pressure of exactly the thing she'd built it to hold. The berm was breaching. The concentrated water that the curve had captured was now punching through the incomplete wall in a growing gap, and as she watched, the gap widened. She put her hands to her face, not to cry, to think. She stood there in the storm, soaked, the rain hammering her shoulders, water running down her neck and her back, and she made herself think past the despair that had arrived, like the storm itself, sudden and total. Think. She had materials in the barn, the extra soil she'd piled for exactly this eventuality, burlap sacks, wooden stakes. The breach was still manageable if she moved now. If she waited until morning, the gap would be twice this size. She ran back to the barn. She loaded what she could into a wheelbarrow. Not enough, probably, but what she had, and she pushed it across the churned, flooding field in the dark, rain blinding her, and she worked for 2 hours in conditions she would not have believed she could work in. She packed earth with her hands. She drove stakes. She laid burlap across the weak spots and shoveled more earth on top, leaning into it with her full weight, compacting it with her boots, stopping every few minutes to check whether it was holding. At some point, she became aware that someone else was beside her. She looked up. Tobin stood in the rain, his nightshirt plastered to him, completely drenched, driving a stake with a hammer he'd apparently brought from the barn without being asked. "Tobin? Where do you need this?" he said. His voice was steady. She looked at him for one moment. This 11-year-old boy standing in the middle of a Nebraska thunderstorm at 1 a.m, holding a hammer, asking where she needed him. And she did not cry, because there wasn't time, but something moved through her chest that she filed away to feel properly later. "Here," she said, pointing. "Drive it there." He drove it there. At 2:30 in the morning, the breach was patched. Not well. It was crude, rough, held together with effort rather than engineering, but it was holding. They walked back to the cabin. Maisie was awake, sitting at the table with the lantern, her face tight with the particular expression of a 7-year-old who had been very frightened and was trying not to show it. "Is it fixed?" she asked. "For tonight," Elowen said. "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Elowen said, pulling the soaked coat off her shoulders. "I fix it properly." She did. She spent 3 days on the breach, rebuilding the damaged section from the base up, this time with more care for the layering, packing the earth in stages, letting each layer consolidate before adding the next, the way the journal had described, and the way she'd been slightly impatient with on the first build. The storm had taught her something. The berm needed to be patient work, not urgent work. The difference between the two was the difference between something that held and something that didn't. Tobin kept measuring. The depth of the remaining water in the trench, the width of the berm at different points. He wrote everything down without being asked to, because that was who he was. And Elowen sometimes looked at his notebook and found herself unable to fully understand how she had produced this child. On the 4th day after the storm, she went to the deep section of the trench, the lowest point, where she'd noticed that coolness in the soil weeks ago, and she found something she had been hoping for and was still not prepared to see. The bottom of the trench was wet, not from the storm's water, which had either soaked in or evaporated in the days since. This was different, a slow, steady seep coming from the south-facing wall of the trench, a thin film of moisture that ran down the clay face and gathered at the base. She crouched and pressed her fingers into it. Cold. Not cool. Cold. The kind of cold that came from below. She sat back on her heels. The seam. The weak seam that Clement's grandfather had written about, that thin layer of water-bearing material she'd been trying to reach, not by digging down, but by pressing water in from above. The storm's rainfall, concentrated and held by the trench and berm, had found it. Or woken it, maybe. Or reminded it that the surface world still existed. She wasn't sure which was the right word. She put her hand against the wet clay face of the trench and felt the cold water seeping slowly against her palm. And for the first time in 7 weeks, she allowed herself to feel something that was not pure effort. She sat there in the bottom of her half-finished trench in the Nebraska sun for a long time. The Fool's Trench was seeping water. She didn't tell anyone in town. She didn't go into Ashwater Crossing for 2 weeks after the storm, partly because she was finishing the trench and had no time, partly because she had supplies enough to manage, and partly, she admitted to herself honestly, because she was not ready. The seep was small. It was steady, but it was small, and she did not know yet whether it would hold, whether it would grow, whether the next dry stretch would pull it back into nothing. She needed time to know what she had before she let anyone else have an opinion about it. What she had, at the end of the 9th week, when the trench was finally complete, all 112 feet of it curving across the contour of the east field, the berm standing 3 feet high along its entire length, the spillway she'd added after the storm providing a controlled exit point for overflow, was this: a functioning earthwork, a repaired and reinforced berm that had now held through 2 subsequent smaller rains without any sign of failure. A deep section that continued to seep cold water at the same slow, steady rate, day after day, regardless of whether it had rained recently. And a field of soil that, when she thrust a stick 18 inches into the earth anywhere near the trench, came out with moisture on the lower third. The soil was waking up. She stood at the end of the trench on the morning of the 64th day and looked at what she'd made. It was not beautiful. It was not straight. It had been patched and rebuilt in 2 sections, and the berm was uneven in places, and there was a low spot near the middle that she'd had to address with additional compaction after the second rain. It looked frankly like what it was: a structure built by a woman alone, under pressure, learning as she went. But it was there, and the bottom of its deep section was wet on a morning that had seen no rain in 11 days. She planted that afternoon. She started with the sorghum because sorghum was the most drought-tolerant thing she had seed for, a hedge, even now, against what July might bring. Then corn, in the section closest to the deep end of the trench where the soil moisture was highest. Beans along the east fence, where the morning sun would be gentler. Squash in the low ground near the spillway, where she expected the runoff to continue enriching the soil through the summer. She planted late, she knew it. Everyone who had been watching her would know it. Tobin helped her count the rows, and Maisie helped drop seeds, because Maisie was very particular about depth and spacing when she was given a task to be particular about, which was its own useful quality. It was late afternoon by the time they finished. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the planted field, looking at the bare, furrowed earth. "It doesn't look like much yet," Maisie said. "It never does yet," Elowen said. "When will we know if it worked?" Elowen looked at the sky, at the land, at the curve of the trench running across the field's edge, the berm standing against the last of the afternoon light. "July," she said. "We'll know in July." News that she'd finally planted reached town before she did. When she went in the following week for supplies, she felt the shift in how people looked at her. Not warmer, not friendlier, but differently calibrated. She had finished the trench. She had planted. The spectacle of her digging had been entertaining, and now the spectacle was over and people were rearranging themselves into a new position. Harlan Pruitt stopped her outside his store. "Heard you got something in the ground finally," he said. He managed to make finally sound neutral, but only barely. "Yes," she said. "Late planting. That's a risk." "I know. My boy planted his north field 3 weeks ago, coming up well." She looked at him. Harlan Pruitt was not a cruel man. She'd decided this about him early on. He was a man who said things that were true without thinking about why he was saying them, which was its own kind of carelessness. "I'm glad for him," she said. "Excuse me." She went into the store. What she didn't say to Harlan Pruitt, what she said to no one, what she turned over in her mind on the drive home, the children quiet beside her, was this: Harlan Pruitt's boy had planted his north field 3 weeks ago, and the north field had no water source except the sky. And the sky, this July, was about to have a very different opinion about what it owed the farmers of Ashwater Crossing. She didn't know that yet, not with certainty, but the weather had a particular feeling to it, the way the evenings cooled wrong, the way the clouds built in the afternoons and then dispersed into thin, dry streaks before they could become anything, the way the wind came from the south more days than not. She had been paying attention to the sky. She drove home with the supplies loaded in the wagon, Maisie half asleep against her arm, Tobin reading his notebook in the fading light, and she thought about July. She thought about the cold water seeping from the south face of the trench. She thought about the soil that came up moist on the lower third of a stick. She thought about what Sella Wren had told her. You're not missing water, you're letting water leave. She hadn't let it leave. She'd held it. Now she needed July to prove that holding it had mattered. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet but steady as that underground seep, she was thinking about Bram Calder's expression the day he'd looked at her trench and laughed. The patient, certain smile of a man who had never once been wrong about what other people were capable of. She was looking forward to July too, in his way. She was just looking forward to it differently. July arrived without warning and without mercy. The last meaningful rain had fallen on the 22nd of June. Tobin had written it in his notebook with the careful precision he brought to everything, noting the time it started, the time it ended, the approximate volume by measuring the depth in a flat tin pan he'd set out specifically for this purpose. After that, nothing. The clouds came and went the way they'd been doing since late spring, building in the afternoon heat into shapes that looked like promises and then dissolving by evening into dry, thin streaks that produced nothing but false hope and a sky that turned colors almost too beautiful to be cruel. But it was cruel. That was the thing about Nebraska summers that the land agents in their eastern offices never put in their pamphlets. The beauty and the cruelty were not separate things. They were the same thing, wearing different faces on different days. By the second week of July, the temperature had climbed past 95 and stayed there. By the third week, it had cleared 100 degrees on 5 consecutive days, and the air itself had a quality Elowen had never experienced before. Not simply hot, but desiccating, pulling moisture out of everything it touched, out of the soil and the grass and the skin on the back of her hands and the wood of the cabin walls, which began to creak and shift in the afternoons in ways they hadn't before. She started carrying water to the cabin's foundation logs with a bucket, wetting them down to prevent cracking. This was not something she'd planned for. It was the kind of problem that arrived unannounced, like all the real problems did. But her crops were not dying. She stood in the east field every morning at dawn, before the heat became something you had to move through rather than walk in. And she looked at the sorghum and the corn and the beans and the squash, and she looked at the soil around them, and what she saw was not lush. She was not going to pretend it was lush because it wasn't, but it was alive. The sorghum in particular, which she'd planted as her hedge against the worst-case scenario, had that dusty blue-green look of a plant managing, of a plant that had found what it needed and was working with it. The soil around the deep end of the trench, near where the underground seep continued its slow, steady work, was measurably different from the soil at the field's far edge. When she pressed her fingers into it in the morning before the heat arrived, there was still give to it, still moisture. Not plenty. She was not sitting on plenty, but enough. The word enough had been doing enormous work in her mind all summer. The trench had changed what enough meant on this piece of ground. She saw it first from a distance. She had driven the wagon into Ashwater Crossing on a Tuesday for supplies, flour, lamp oil, a new handle for the short-handled hoe she'd broken on a rock. And on the way back out of town, she passed the Prewitt farm, which sat close to the road. And she looked automatically at the Northfield Harlan had mentioned, the one his boy had planted 3 weeks before she'd gotten her own seed in the ground. She almost didn't recognize what she was looking at. The corn was brown. Not browning. Not the yellow going brown of a plant under stress that might recover with rain. Brown. Done. The stalks stood at about half the height they should have been at this point in summer, leaves curled tight and dead, the whole field looking like something had passed through it and taken the life out. From the road, it looked like a field of dried sticks. She kept driving. She didn't slow down. But she thought about it the whole 4 miles home. Harlan Pruitt's boy had planted right. He had planted at the right time, in the conventional way, with good seed and good intention. And the ground had held no water for him when the rain stopped coming, and so the crop had nothing to draw on when July arrived and took everything the surface held. Her own field was not perfect. She needed to be honest with herself about that. The late planting had cost her. The sorghum was behind where it should be, and the corn was shorter than she'd hoped, and there were 2 rows of beans near the north end of the field that she was genuinely worried about. In a dry weather stretch that thin, they might not make it. She went to those beans every morning with a bucket from the trench's gathered pool, giving them what she could. It was slow work. It was not a solution exactly, but it was a bridge. The squash was doing best of all. She had not expected that. The low ground near the spillway had accumulated a richness she hadn't fully anticipated, and the squash plants had spread in a way that was almost aggressive, their broad leaves covering the soil around them and shading the roots, holding the moisture underneath. She looked at those plants sometimes with something close to bewilderment, the way you look at something you planned that turned out better than you planned it. She had not done everything right, but she had done enough things right that the land was working with her instead of against her. The first neighbor to say anything to her face was a woman named Clara Mott. Clara Mott's husband had 40 acres south of town, and they grew primarily corn. She stopped Elowen outside the dry goods section of Pell's store on a Thursday morning in mid-July, and she had the look of a woman who had been rehearsing something. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you won't take offense." "Ask," Elowen said. "Your field." Clara glanced around, then lowered her voice, as if being overheard was a serious risk in an empty store. "People have been talking about how it looks, compared to others. And my husband and I, our corn isn't—" She stopped, started again. "Is it true that the trench is keeping moisture in your soil?" Elowen looked at her. Clara Mott was not Dora Fitch. Clara Mott was a woman asking a practical question because she was frightened, and the difference mattered. "Yes," Elowen said. "The trench slowed the storm runoff and forced it into the ground. There's also a weak water seam that's been activated by the increased infiltration. Both things are helping." Clara was quiet for a moment. A water seam. A thin layer of water-bearing material. Not enough to drill a well to, August Farrell confirmed that months ago, but enough to feed moisture up slowly through the soil when there's been water pressing down from above. "And your crops are not perfect," Elowen said, because she didn't want Clara Mott going home with the wrong idea. "My late planting hurt. I have rows I'm worried about, but the field is alive." Clara looked at her for a moment, and there was something in her expression that was complicated. Relief and the remains of doubt mixed together, and underneath both of them, something that might have been embarrassment. "I heard what people were calling it," Clara said. "The Fool's Trench. I never—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. Some people were unkind." "Yes," Elowen agreed. "They were." There wasn't much else to say about it. Elowen bought her supplies and drove home. But she noticed, on the way out of town, that Clara Mott was standing on the boardwalk watching her wagon go, and that she appeared to be thinking very hard about something. What? The wells started failing in the third week of July. Not all at once. First it was the Greer family, whose shallow well had always been temperamental in dry years. They'd managed it before, but this year the water table had dropped further and faster than anyone expected. Then the Lund farm, a mile east of town, whose well went from low to dry in the space of 4 days. Then the Motts, which Elowen heard about from Ruthie at the hardware store when she came in to replace a broken shovel handle, and which explained the particular expression Clara Mott had worn when she'd asked about moisture retention. By the last week of July, 3 more wells had either failed or dropped to levels that made them unreliable, and the community pond on the south edge of town, a reliable source for cattle and horses in previous dry years, had shrunk to a shallow, muddy ring around a center that was more mud than water. She heard all of this from Ruthie, who heard all of it from everyone. "Calder's Pond is low too," Ruthie added with the careful neutrality of someone conveying information they found privately satisfying. "His hands have been hauling water from the creek, but the creek's way down from normal. He's got a lot of cattle to water." Elowen said nothing. "People are talking about you again," Ruthie said. "Different kind of talking." "I know." "Your field is alive," Elowen said simply. Ruthie looked at her for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I should have said something. When people were calling it the Fool's Trench, I shouldn't have just told you about it. I should have—" "Ruthie," Elowen said, "it's done. Let it go." She paid for her shovel handle and went back to the wagon. What? What happened next she hadn't planned for. Not exactly. She had imagined various versions of the summer, the trench failing, the trench succeeding, July being wet, July being dry. But she had not imagined this particular sequence of events, which arrived the way most consequential things did, one at a time, each one slightly larger than the last. It started with a boy. She was working the south end of the field in the early morning when she heard someone at the property gate, a sound she'd come to recognize because the gate had a particular creak that varied with how fast it was opened. She looked up and saw a boy of about 12, thin and dusty and sunburned, standing at the gate with a large wooden barrel on a small two-wheeled cart behind him. She didn't know him. She walked over. "You the woman with the water?" he said. She looked at him. "What water?" He pointed at the trench. More specifically, at the deep section where the seep had gradually turned the lowest pool into something that could, with generosity, be called a reliable source. The pool was not large, maybe 6 feet across, maybe 18 inches deep at the center, but it was cold and it was steady and it had not diminished in 3 weeks of 100-degree heat. "My ma sent me," the boy said. "Mrs. Delacroix. We're on the Miller Road, north side. Our well's been dry 4 days." Elowen looked at him. She looked at the barrel on the cart. She thought about several things at once. She thought about the size of the pool and how much daily seep replenished it. She thought about how many families might be in similar situations. She thought about the cold water she'd felt against her palm in the bottom of the trench, steady as a heartbeat, the day she'd first found it. She thought about what it would cost her to share it. And then she stopped thinking about that because the answer to that question was not complicated and she knew it. "Bring the cart through the gate," she said. She helped him fill the barrel. Word traveled the way. Word always traveled in Ashwater Crossing, fast, specific, and slightly distorted by the time it reached the third person. But the core of it was accurate. The widow with the ditch had water. Not a well, not a pond, but a slow underground seep that had been coaxed to the surface by an earthwork most people had spent weeks mocking, and the water was cold and clean, and it had not stopped flowing in 3 weeks of the worst drought anyone under 50 could remember. Within 2 days, she had 4 families come to fill containers. Within 5 days, it was 8. She made a practical decision she had not anticipated making. She assigned times. Not because she wanted to be official about it, she felt self-conscious about the formality of it, but because she couldn't have 8 families arriving at random throughout the day while she was trying to work the field that had to produce a harvest if any of this was going to matter past November. Mornings, from 6 until 8, she opened the trench access to whoever came. Afternoons, from 4 until 6, same. The rest of the time she was in the field or doing chores, and people understood this, or most of them did. Tobin managed the morning shift without being asked. He simply began doing it, standing at the deep section with a long-handled ladle she didn't know they owned, helping families lower their containers into the pool, keeping track of what was taken, and approximately how much the seep replenished overnight. He wrote it all in his notebook. Volume in, volume replenished, temperature, weather conditions. He was 11 years old and he was maintaining what was effectively a hydrological record of an improvised water source in a drought, and Elowen watched him do it with a feeling she could not have named if she'd tried. Maisie helped the families wait. This was not a task anyone had assigned her. She simply observed that families arrived with hot, tired children, and that hot, tired children were easier to manage if someone engaged them, and she appointed herself to this role with the complete authority of a 7-year-old who has decided something is her job. She had a game involving pebbles and a particular counting system that she appeared to invent on the spot and that the children found inexplicably compelling. Adults who arrived stressed and worried left slightly less stressed, partly because of the water, and partly because for 20 minutes their children had been occupied and entertained by a small girl with dark braids and very strong opinions about the correct way to sort rocks by color. Elowen saw this and said nothing about it to Maisie directly, because saying it directly would have made it self-conscious, and Maisie operated best without self-consciousness. She simply noted it in the way a farmer notes that something useful is growing in the field without being planted there. Calder came on a Tuesday. Not in the morning, and not in the afternoon, during the hours she'd set aside for water access. He came at noon, when the heat had risen to its daily worst, and the air above the dry fields shimmered, and everyone with sense was finding shade. He came alone this time, no ranch hands, no theater of confident men behind him. He came on the same expensive horse, and he wore the same well-made clothes, and he still did not knock at the gate, but the absence of his audience changed something about how he carried himself. He stopped at the edge of her field and looked at it for a long time before he spoke. She was there already. She'd seen him coming from half a mile out. She'd gotten good at reading movement on the flat horizon. And she'd kept working because stopping to receive him would have given him something she wasn't willing to give. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Mr. Calder." He looked at the sorghum, the corn, the beans that had, against her worried predictions, come back in the last 10 days since the underground seep had strengthened marginally, the plants finding some thread of moisture she hadn't expected to reach them and pulling themselves back from the edge she'd thought was too far. He looked at the trench, its berm standing clean in the hard sun, the spillway she'd built at the lower end. "Your pond is dry," she said. She said it without inflection, not as a taunt, just as a fact. He was quiet for a moment. "The pond is low," he said, which was not the same as agreeing with her, but was not exactly disagreement either. "Your cattle need water." A pause. "They do." She stopped working. She straightened and looked at him, and this time she looked at him the way she had not allowed herself to look at him in any of their previous meetings. Directly, with the full weight of knowing exactly what position each of them occupied right now and why. "What would you like to say to me, Mr. Calder?" He was not a man accustomed to questions that direct. She watched him recalibrate. "You have water," he said finally. "I have a seep. It's not large. It's more than I've got right now." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He shifted his weight on the horse. The horse flicked its tail. Somewhere in the field behind her, a locust clicked and buzzed in the heat. "I'd like to buy access," he said, "for the cattle. Not every day. I have the creek still. It's just low. But supplemental. On the worst days." She looked at him. The man who had laughed at her trench with 3 of his hands standing behind him. The man who had told her, in that patient, certain voice, that she needed to sign the paper before this land took something from her she couldn't get back. The man who had stood on the boardwalk outside the post office and said things that made people laugh through the walls. "No," she said. He blinked. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but she saw it. "I'm prepared to pay well," he said. "I don't doubt it." "Mrs. Voss? Families in this community are using that water," she said. "The Delacroix family, the Motts, the Lund family. People whose wells failed and who have children to feed and livestock to keep alive. The seep isn't unlimited. I give what I can each day, and what's left isn't mine to sell to whoever offers the most." She looked at him steadily. "That's not how water works. Not when people are doing without it." His jaw was tight. "Besides," she said, and she heard her own voice do something she hadn't entirely planned, something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. "Your cattle are not the community's children. They're your investment. That's a different kind of need." He looked at her for a long moment. "You could have made good money today," he said. "I know that." "Most people in your situation—" "Mr. Calder," she said, "I'm going to go back to work now. If you'd like to send men with barrels during the morning or afternoon hours, same as everyone else, you're welcome to. No special access. No payment. Same as everyone." She turned back to the field. She heard him there behind her for another long moment. The horse breathing, the creak of the saddle. Then hoofbeats, moving away. She let out a breath slowly. Her hands were shaking again, the same way they'd shaken the very first time he'd come to her door. The same physical response to the effort of remaining completely still while every part of her moved. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs until they stopped. Then she picked up the hoe. She did not understand at first what Calder was going to do next. She understood that he was not done. She understood this about him the way you understand certain things about certain people, not from specific evidence, but from the texture of the encounter, the particular quality of how he'd ridden away, not fast and not slow, but with the gait of a man reorganizing his approach rather than abandoning it. She was right. Ruthie told her about it 10 days later, on Elowen's next supply run into town. The words came out of Ruthie in the same helpless rush as always, with the same apologetic quality, but this time there was something different underneath it. A sharpness, a worry that Ruthie was not entirely able to disguise as mere information sharing. Calder had spoken to Howard Beale. Howard Beale was the county property assessor, a quiet, careful man who administered the homestead claims in the region and who had authority, limited but real, to raise concerns about whether a homesteader was meeting the cultivation requirements of their land claim. The requirements were not complicated. You had to demonstrate that you were actively working the land, farming it, making productive use of it within a reasonable period. Calder had, apparently, suggested to Howard Beale that Elowen Voss had spent the majority of her critical planting season digging a ditch rather than farming. and that a formal review of her claim might be warranted. Elowen sat with this information in the wagon on the way home, the reins loose in her hands, letting the horse find its own pace. She went through it carefully, the way she'd gone through the numbers that first night in the cabin. What was true, what was provable, what Calder's argument actually was, and how it would be presented. His argument, stripped to its bones, was this. She had not planted during the conventional planting window, and the time she'd spent digging could be characterized as a failure to farm. The fact that the digging was itself preparation for farming, preparation that had made farming possible on land that could not otherwise sustain it, was the thing she would have to prove. It was not an impossible argument to defend, but it was a serious one. If she lost a formal review, she could lose the homestead, the land, the trench, the seep, the field she was harvesting, everything. She got home and went directly to the field. She walked its length in the late afternoon heat, looking at the sorghum that was heading now, the corn that was not what she'd hoped, but was real and alive, the beans she'd saved by hauling water to them in the early weeks, the squash that had exceeded everything she'd imagined. She walked back to the trench and stood looking at the deep section, where the seep fed its steady, cold thread of water up through the soil of a field that was producing a crop in a summer that had broken most of the other crops in the county. Then she went inside, sat down at the table, and opened Tobin's notebook. He had been keeping records since the day they arrived. Rainfall dates and volumes, planting dates, water levels in the trench, soil moisture observations, germination dates, growth measurements, temperature records. She turned pages slowly, reading what he had written in his small, careful hand. Every fact was there, every single one. She sat back. She thought about Howard Beale. She thought about what a formal hearing would look like, who would be in that room, what they would be deciding. She thought about the families who had been coming to her trench for water every morning and every afternoon for weeks now, carrying their barrels and their buckets, tired and worried and grateful. She thought about Clara Mott and her husband's failing corn. She thought about the Delacroix boy with his two-wheeled cart, the first one, the one who'd come to the gate and said, "You the woman with the water?" She thought about Calder in front of the post office, laughing with three men while people inside heard it through the walls. She made a decision. She was not going to hire a lawyer. She did not have the money for a lawyer, and more to the point, she did not believe a lawyer would be her strongest argument. Her strongest argument was in this notebook. Her strongest argument was in the field outside, alive and producing in the worst drought in recent memory. Her strongest argument was the community that had been coming to her trench, whose names Tobin had faithfully recorded in the water log he'd started keeping on the third day. She was going to put the land itself on trial, and she was going to do it herself. The hearing was set for late August. Between Ruthie's news and the date of the hearing, Elowen had approximately 3 weeks, and she used them with the same focused, grinding effort she'd applied to digging the trench. She went to see August Farrell, the well driller, and she asked him to come out to the property and look at the soil moisture in the field near the trench. He came on a Saturday morning, prodding the earth with his long rod, crouching and pressing his fingers into the soil the same way she had the day she'd first noticed the coolness. And when he stood up, his expression was not surprise exactly. He was a man who'd seen enough of this country to absorb surprises quietly. But it was something she recognized as professional acknowledgement. "That's unusual," he said. "I know. You've got real moisture retention here, near that lower section." He pressed the rod in again at a different point, pulled it out, looked at the tip. "How long since significant rain?" 26 days, Elowen said. He looked at her. "You coaxed that seam up," he said. Not a question. "I think the infiltration from the storm water reached it and expanded it. It was weak before, too weak to drill to, but with sustained pressure from above over several months. It found a level it can maintain," Farrell said. He looked at the trench. He looked at the berm. He looked at the field beyond it, green against the surrounding brown that was Nebraska in late July. "I've been drilling wells in this county for 30 years, he said. "I've never seen someone do it this way." "The journal described it," she said. "Whose journal?" "My husband's grandfather. He tried it in a different state in the 1850s. Farrell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll testify to what I'm seeing here. If it comes to a hearing, what you've done is legitimate groundwater management, Unconventional, but legitimate. She had not asked him. She had not said anything about the hearing. She looked at him. He shrugged slightly. Word moves fast, he said. She felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Thank you, she said. She went back to see Sella Wren. The old woman was where she'd been the first time, in her garden, moving along the rows with the careful, deliberate attention of someone for whom every plant was a relationship rather than a product. She looked up when Elowen arrived and did not seem surprised. Calder's coming for the claim, Elowen said, because there was no point in the long approach. I heard, Sella said. She straightened up. What do you need? I want to understand what I've actually done, Elowen said, so I can explain it to a hearing, the language of it, the principle. I know what worked, but I want to know why well enough to say it plainly in front of a judge. Sella Wren looked at her for a moment. Sit down, she said. She gestured at a wooden bench near the garden's edge, the kind of bench that had been rained on and sun-dried so many times it had gone silver gray and smooth. I'm going to tell you what your trench did. In plain language that even a county judge can follow. And then you're going to tell it back to me until you can say it without thinking about the words. Elowen sat down. Sella pulled a stool from somewhere and sat across from her, still holding the small trowel she'd been using in the garden. Waterfalls, Sella said. On baked ground, it doesn't sink. It moves. It follows slope, follows gravity, goes somewhere else. What you built intercepted that movement. You put a curved wall in the water's path, and you held it. And because you held it, it had time to sink into the ground instead of running off. And because it sank in one concentrated place, over time, it found the weak seam and gave it enough pressure to start flowing sideways. The seam was always there. You woke it up by giving it what it needed from above. She paused. That's water management, she said. Farming is water management. Everything else is secondary. She looked at Elowen steadily. Bram Calder is going to tell that judge you spent your planting season digging instead of farming. What you're going to tell the judge is that you spent your planting season making farming possible on land that couldn't otherwise sustain it. Those are different arguments. Make sure the judge understands the difference. Elowen said it back to her. Then she said it again. She drove home in the late afternoon light, going over the words in her head, fitting them into an order that was plain and clear and could not be easily argued around. She was not a lawyer and she was not going to sound like one, and she thought that might actually be useful. That sounding like herself, a woman who had worked this land with her own hands and learned it the way you learn things by doing them, was a different kind of authority than legal language. She had 43 days of Tobin's records. She had August Farrell's professional assessment. She had the names of every family who had drawn water from her trench in a drought that was still ongoing. And she had the field, still green, still alive, still growing in the face of the same sky that had broken everything else around it. The heat broke slightly in the last week of July. Not significantly, not enough to call rain, but the temperature dropped by 8 degrees and held there. And that change was enough to shift the quality of the air from suffocating to merely brutal. People in Ashwater Crossing moved differently in that slight cooling, as though they'd been holding their breath and had just been given permission to exhale. Elowen began the harvest on the squash first, because the squash was ready and waiting. The largest fruit she'd ever seen from a summer garden, their skins hardened by the heat into something that would keep well. She and the children picked for a full afternoon and ended with more than she had storage space for. She stood looking at the pile of squash in the barn and thought about what to do with the excess. Tobin was looking at it too. There's a lot, he said. Yes. We can't eat all of it before it turns. No. He waited. He was good at waiting. We could give some away, she said. The families who've been coming for water. He was quiet for a moment, then, Calder's going to argue you failed to cultivate. Would giving away your crop look like you don't need it? She looked at him. 11 years old. That's a good question, she said. I could write down who gets what, he said. In the notebook. So there's a record. She looked at this child who had figured out, without being told, that everything right now needed to be in the record. Yes, she said. Write it down. They began distributing the squash the next morning during the early water hour. Each family that came with containers left with squash, 3 or 4 fruits, more for the larger families. Tobin recorded it all. Family name. Amount. Date. The Delacroix boy came with his two-wheeled cart. He looked at the squash, then at Elowen, then at Tobin writing in the notebook. "We don't got anything to trade," he said. "I know," Elowen said. "Take 4. The big ones have harder skin. They'll keep longer." He loaded them onto the cart without saying anything else. At the gate he stopped and looked back. "My ma says thank you," he said. "She says to tell you—" He stopped, something complicated in his young face. "She says she was wrong about the ditch." Elowen looked at him. "Tell her I was lucky," she said, "and that I had a good journal." He nodded, not entirely sure what that meant, and pushed the cart back out the gate. She watched him go. The hearing was in 3 weeks. She was not ready. She was also as ready as she was going to get, which she was learning were sometimes the same state. The night before the hearing, Maisie came to her while she was sitting at the table with Tobin's notebook spread open in front of her. "Mama," she said, "are we going to lose the farm?" Elowen looked at her daughter. Maisie's face in the lamplight was very young and very serious, and Elowen thought about the 100 ways she wanted to answer that question, and the one way she actually could. "I don't know," she said. Maisie sat down in the other chair. "But you're going to try," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elowen said. "I'm going to try." Maisie looked at the notebook. "Tobin wrote a lot." "He did." "Will it help?" Elowen put her hand flat on the open page. Tobin's careful columns of numbers, his dates and measurements and observations, 63 days of a child paying attention to something because it mattered. "Yes," she said. "I think it will help." She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She lay in the dark, listening to the prairie breathe outside the window, and she thought about what Sela Wren had told her, about water that falls and runs and finds the path of least resistance, and about what it meant to put something in that path, to hold the water still long enough for the ground to receive it. You hold it, she thought, and it sinks in, and it finds what was always there waiting for it. She was not sure entirely whether she was thinking about water anymore. She slept eventually, fitfully, but she slept. The morning of the hearing, Elowen woke at 4:30, not because of the children and not because of a sound. She simply woke, the way she'd been waking since July, her body having decided somewhere in the last 2 months that sleep was a thing to be managed carefully, rationed, used efficiently rather than enjoyed. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to Maisie's breathing from the other side of the curtain, and then she got up and put the kettle on and sat at the table with Tobin's notebook and went through it one more time. She had read it so many times in the last 3 weeks that she could have recited sections of it from memory. But there was something steadying about the physical act of reading it, about running her finger down Tobin's columns of numbers, his careful dates, the small annotations he'd added in the margins when something didn't fit the columns. July 9. Soil at Stake Point C shows moisture at 14 inches depth, despite 18 days without rain. July 14. Seep volume appears slightly increased following yesterday's temperature drop. July 22nd. 3 additional families drawing water, total now 11 households. She turned to the water log. 41 families, by the final count. 41 families who had come through her gate with containers, whose names Tobin had written down, whose amounts he had recorded with the same steady attention he brought to everything. She closed the notebook and set it on the table. She was not confident. She wanted to be honest with herself about that because she had found that false confidence was more dangerous than acknowledged fear. It made you careless. What she was, instead of confident, was prepared. She knew what she was going to say. She knew what Calder's attorney was going to argue. She knew what the counterargument was, and she knew how to make it in plain language that did not require a law degree to follow. She also knew that none of that guaranteed anything. She drank her tea. She let the children sleep until 6. Then she woke them and told them to dress in their good clothes. Tobin came downstairs with his notebook under his arm. She hadn't asked him to bring it. She hadn't said anything to him about the hearing beyond the basic facts. What it was, what was being decided, that they needed to go into town. He'd listened to all of it with his characteristic stillness, asked 2 precise questions about what Calder's argument would specifically be, and then gone back to his regular evening work without apparent agitation. She had no idea what he actually felt about it, and she'd learned not to press him, because pressing Tobin produced walls rather than openings. But he came downstairs with his notebook and his good shirt with the collar buttoned, and he set the notebook on the table next to her and said, "I put the waterlog at the front, tabbed it." She looked at him. "With a piece of red ribbon," he added, "so you can find it fast." "Thank you," she said. He sat down and ate his breakfast. Maisie, who had dressed herself in her best dress and then apparently reconsidered and added a hair ribbon that didn't quite match, ate her porridge with an expression of concentrated solemnity that she appeared to believe was appropriate to the occasion. She didn't ask questions. She also didn't stop watching Elowen's face, a constant peripheral attention that Elowen felt but didn't acknowledge. At 7 o'clock, they got in the wagon and drove to Ashwater Crossing. The county hearing room was in the back of the municipal building, which was also the post office and the land records office, a fact that gave the space a crowded, multi-purpose quality, as though justice were simply one of several services offered in the same building, alongside mail sorting and property assessment. The room had 8 rows of wooden benches, a raised platform at the front with a long table and 3 chairs, and a coal stove in the corner that was dark and cold on this August morning. What it had, which Elowen had not anticipated, was people. She had expected a formal proceeding, a few officials, Calder, his attorney, perhaps Howard Beale. What she found when she walked in was a room that was nearly full. Not half full. Nearly full. She stopped in the doorway. Clara Mott was in the 3rd row. The Delacroix family, the mother, 2 younger children, and the boy with the cart, taller seeming without the cart, were in the 5th row. August Farrell sat near the window, his hat on his knee. She saw Ruthie from the hardware store. She saw 2 families she recognized from the water hours, whose names she knew from Tobin's log, but hadn't spoken to more than a handful of times. She saw Harlan Pruitt, which surprised her, sitting near the back with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. She saw Sella Wren, very small, very upright, in the end seat of the 2nd row. She walked to the front and sat in the chair that had been set out for her, the notebook on the table in front of her. On the other side of the room, Calder sat with a man she didn't recognize, a broad-faced man in a good coat with a leather case on his knee, who had the particular contained alertness of a professional being paid to be in a room. His eyes moved over Elowen once, briefly, and then moved to the crowd, and she saw something shift in his expression. The slightest recalibration, a professional noticing that the room was not what he'd expected. Good, she thought. Notice that. The judge was a man named Aldous Cray, county circuit judge, mid-60s, a face that had been weathered by decades of the same Nebraska sun that was currently destroying crops throughout the region. He came in from a side door at 9 o'clock exactly, sat at the center of the long table, looked at the room for a moment without expression, and opened the proceeding without preamble. This is a review petition filed by Bram Calder regarding the homestead claim of Elowen Voss. 120 acres on the East Road, 4 miles from this town, he said. Mr. Calder's petition argues that Mrs. Voss failed to meet the cultivation requirements of her homestead claim during the critical spring planting period. Having spent that period engaged in non-farming activities, Mrs. Voss represents herself. He looked at Elowen over the top of his reading glasses. "Is that correct, Mrs. Voss?" "Yes, sir," she said. "All right." He looked at Calder's attorney. "Mr. Holt, present your argument." What? Holt was good. She had expected competent, and he was better than competent. He presented his argument in clean, organized segments that built logically from one to the next. The standard cultivation requirements, the established planting calendar for this region, the documented fact that Elowen Voss had not planted until weeks after the conventional window, the implication that this delay constituted a failure to actively farm the land. He did not mention the drought. He mentioned it briefly, almost in passing, acknowledged that the summer had been dry, moved on quickly. She noted this. It was a careful choice because the drought was the context that made her decisions legible, and he wanted the judge focused on the calendar rather than the conditions. He also, she noticed, did not come to the question of what she had been doing instead of planting. He described it as digging. He used the word excavation once, with a slight emphasis that managed to make it sound like something irrelevant to agriculture. He never described what the excavation was for, or what it had produced. He was banking on the judge not asking. When Holt finished, Judge Cray looked at Elowen. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "your response." She stood up. She had decided in the 3 weeks of preparation that she was going to start not with herself but with the land, with the problem. Because if the judge didn't understand the problem first, her solution would make no sense. I want to start with the soil, she said, on my property. She explained it. The clay, the slope, the way baked ground sheds water instead of absorbing it, the dry creek. August Farrell's estimate for a well that she did not have the money to drill. She spoke plainly, without legal language, the way she'd practiced with Sela Wren, the way you'd explain something to a neighbor who was intelligent but had never thought about this particular problem before. She explained what Sela had told her about paying attention to the sky. She explained the journal, Clement's grandfather, the 1850s, the contour ditch principle. She explained what she'd understood, that the land wasn't missing water, it was losing water, and that the question wasn't how to find water underground, but how to keep the water that was already falling from leaving. She explained the trench, not just that she'd built it, she explained why each element was necessary. The curve, for speed reduction. The berm, for containment. The spillway, for controlled overflow, so the structure wouldn't breach under pressure. A lesson, she said, that she'd learned the hard way, in the middle of a thunderstorm at 1 a.m, when part of the original berm gave way and she and her son rebuilt it in the rain. She heard something shift in the room when she said that. Not a sound exactly, more a quality of attention. She kept going. She explained the underground seam. She explained how sustained water infiltration from above had found and expanded a weak water-bearing layer that was too shallow and fragile to support a conventional well, but was sufficient, given the right conditions, to provide steady soil moisture and a slow surface seep. She explained that she had planted, late, yes, she acknowledged it plainly, without defensiveness, but she had planted, and her field had produced a crop, and that crop was still alive and growing in a summer that had broken most of the conventional crops in the county. Mr. Holt's argument is that I didn't farm during my planting window, she said. What I'd ask the court to consider is this. Farming is not only the act of putting seed in the ground. Farming is making the ground capable of sustaining what you plant. If I had planted in the conventional window, on ground that shed all its water, with no reliable source of moisture, my seed would have failed in July with everything else. The question isn't whether I planted on schedule. The question is whether what I did instead of early planting was legitimate preparation of agricultural land. She paused. I believe it was. I believe the evidence shows it was. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Judge Cray looked at her over his glasses, and she could not read his expression, which was either a good sign or a bad one, and she had no way to know which. Mr. Holt, he said, you may respond. Holt's response was competent and somewhat diminished. He returned to the calendar argument, but it had less force now that she'd established the context he'd tried to avoid. He was arguing about dates in a room full of people who had spent the last 6 weeks coming to her property for water because their own sources had failed. He made one move she hadn't fully anticipated. He questioned the practicality of the seep, suggested that a small underground seam was not a reliable agricultural water source, that depending on it was itself a form of poor farming judgment. He was trying to reframe her solution as another variety of failure. She stood again when Judge Cray gave her the opportunity. I'd like to call August Farrell, she said. Farrell came forward. He was not a man who used extra words. He described what he'd seen when he'd come to examine the field, in the specific language of someone who'd spent 30 years working with groundwater in this region. He described the soil moisture retention he'd measured. He described the seep, its temperature, its consistency, what it indicated about the water-bearing layer below. He said, in the plain professional voice of a man reporting what he knew, what Mrs. Voss has done is legitimate groundwater management, unconventional in method, not unconventional in principle. She's done what farmers have been trying to do in dry country for 100 years. She's found a way to hold water near her root zone. Holt tried to question him on the seep's reliability. Farrell looked at him with the mild expression of a man who has been asked a question he finds slightly insulting. It's been flowing steady for 6 weeks, Farrell said, through the worst stretch of heat this county's seen in 20 years. That's your reliability measure. Holt moved on. She had not planned to call Clara Mott, but Clara Mott stood up. She stood up from the third row without being asked, without looking at anyone else in the room for permission, and she said, Your Honor, I'd like to say something. Judge Cray looked at her. He looked at Elowen. He looked back at Clara. This isn't a... he started. My family's well failed on July 19th, Clara Mott said. She said it steadily, with the voice of a woman who had decided she was going to say a thing and was going to say it regardless of procedural niceties. We have 4 children and 20 head of cattle. Between July 19th and today, we have drawn water from Mrs. Voss's property on 14 occasions. Without it, she stopped. I don't want to think about what without it means. She sat back down. There was a moment of quiet, and then something happened that Elowen had not planned for or anticipated in any of the 3 weeks of preparation, and which she would remember for the rest of her life. The Delacroix woman stood up. She was a small woman, work-worn, with the look of someone who'd been managing difficulty quietly for a long time. She said, "We drew water 11 times. My children were sick from the heat, and we had nothing from our well. Mrs. Voss charged nothing." She sat down. A man Elowen knew only as one of the Lund family stood up. "Our well went dry July 23rd. We have water now because of what Mrs. Voss built." He sat down. Another family. Then another. They stood up one at a time, without coordination, without anyone having organized them. She was certain no one had organized them, because she had organized nothing, and there had been no meeting. And they each said briefly what they needed to say. Some gave only a sentence. Some gave 2 or 3. One woman began to say something, and then stopped and simply said, "She kept us," and sat down. Elowen sat very still at her table. She did not look at Calder. She did not look at Holt. She looked at her hands, flat on the table on either side of the notebook, and she breathed carefully, and she did not let anything happen in her face that she didn't intend, because she was not going to cry in this room. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because it would shift the nature of what was happening, and what was happening right now was not about her feelings. It was about the land. Tobin, beside her on the bench he'd moved to sit on during the proceedings, touched her arm once, briefly, with 2 fingers, and then took his hand back. She didn't look at him either. Judge Cray waited until the standing had finished. He did not try to stop it, which told her something about him. When the room had settled, he said, "Mr. Holt, do you have anything further?" Holt's face had the careful neutrality of a professional who knew when the ground had shifted beneath him and was deciding whether to acknowledge it or proceed as though it hadn't. "The core legal question remains the cultivation timeline," he said. He said it with slightly less conviction than he'd brought to his opening. Said Judge Cray. "Tobin," she said quietly. He was already standing. He had the notebook open to the section he'd tabbed with red ribbon. The water log, 41 families, the full record. He walked to the front and set it on the judge's table without fanfare, and then walked back and sat down. Judge Cray looked at the page. He turned a few pages forward, a few back. He looked at the planting records, the dates, the germination observations, the crop measurements. He looked at the rainfall log. He looked at the water level records in the trench, the temperature readings, the soil moisture notes. He spent a long time with the notebook. Holt waited. Elowen waited. The room waited. Outside, through the single window, she could hear the ordinary sounds of Ashwater Crossing continuing its ordinary day. A horse somewhere, a door, the distant sound of someone's voice. Normal sounds, the sound of a world that didn't know whether she was about to lose everything. Judge Cray set the notebook down. He took his glasses off and set them on the table beside it. He looked at Calder. Calder, she noticed for the first time since the hearing started, was sitting slightly differently than he'd sat at the beginning. Not dramatically. He was still Bram Calder, still the largest presence in any room, still wearing his good coat and his authority like they were part of his body. But he was sitting with his weight slightly back, and his hands, which had been resting flat on his knees at the start, were now loosely clasped. He was a man watching a situation he thought he'd controlled reach an outcome he had not controlled. Judge Cray looked at Elowen. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "what's in this field right now, today?" "Sorghum, corn, beans, and squash," she said. "The sorghum is heading. The corn is approximately 3 weeks behind what I'd have expected from a conventional timed planting, but it's viable. It should make before the first frost. The beans recovered after I was able to get them water from the trench in early July. The squash exceeded my expectations. I've been distributing the squash surplus to community members since harvest began." He nodded slowly. "And you're saying that without the earthwork, you couldn't have sustained any of it through this summer's drought. Without the earthwork, I'd have been drawing water by hand from a neighbor's well, or from town, if I could get it, for the critical period, and I wouldn't have had enough for the field. The field would be what you see everywhere else in the county right now. He was quiet for a moment. I've been on the circuit in Nebraska for 19 years, he said, and this had the quality of something he was saying partly to himself. I've seen a lot of homestead disputes, a lot of arguments about what constitutes proper cultivation. He picked up his glasses, put them back on. I have not seen a case where the question was whether building a water management system was farming. Holt started to speak. Judge Cray held up one hand. Holt stopped. In my judgment, he said, preparing land for agricultural production is not distinct from farming. It is farming. A man who drills a well before he plants is not failing to farm. He is making farming possible. A woman who builds an earthwork to capture and retain water before she plants is not failing to farm. She is making farming possible. He paused. The fact that the method is unusual does not make it illegitimate. The fact that it succeeded, in conditions under which conventional farming has broadly failed in this county, is evidence in favor of its legitimacy, not against it. He closed the notebook. Mr. Calder's petition is dismissed, he said. The homestead claim of Elowen Voss stands. The sound in the room was not applause. It was something quieter and more complicated than applause. An exhaled breath, maybe, from several people at once, and then the sound of people shifting, of the particular rustling that a room makes when it releases a tension it's been holding. Someone said something low, and someone else responded, and then there was more conversation starting up in the way conversation does when a collective holding of breath finally ends. Elowen sat at the table for a moment. She looked at the notebook in front of her, Tobin's handwriting, his careful columns, the red ribbon marking the waterlog. She picked it up and held it in both hands. She was aware that her legs, when she stood up, were going to be unreliable, and she gave them a moment to remember their purpose before she pushed back the chair and stood. Tobin was there. He handed her the notebook without a word, and she tucked it under her arm. Maisie had somehow gotten from the bench to her side in approximately 3 seconds, which was Maisie's general velocity when she had decided she was going somewhere, and she pressed against Elowen's hip with the full weight of her small body and did not say anything, which was unusual enough that it told Elowen everything she needed to know about how frightened her daughter had been. She put her hand on Maisie's head. "We're all right," she said quietly. "I know," Maisie said into her side. Calder left quickly. She caught a glimpse of him going out the side door with Holt, not hurrying, but not lingering, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew how to exit a room without making his exit look like flight. She did not try to speak to him. She didn't know what she would have said, and she suspected that whatever she felt in this moment was too complicated and too raw to be trusted in direct conversation with a man who had spent the last several months trying to take her land. Maybe later she would have words for it. Right now she had only the tight, burning feeling in her chest that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, and was entirely its own thing. August Farrell stopped her near the door. "Good result," he said simply. "Thank you for what you said," she told him. "It mattered." He nodded, put his hat on, and went out. Sella Wren was next. She appeared at Elowen's elbow with the quietness of someone who had been moving through the world for long enough that she knew how to do it without taking up more space than necessary. "You said it right," she said. "I kept thinking about what you told me," Elowen said, "about the water finding the path." "That's what you did too," Sella said. She looked at Elowen with those direct, unadorned eyes. "You found the path. Took you long enough, but you found it." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something smaller and more private than that. Then she went out. Clara Mott caught her arm. She said, "I want to apologize." Clara, no. She said it firmly. "I want to say it. I heard what people were calling it, the Fool's Trench. I didn't say it. I didn't use the word, but I didn't push back either, and I should have." She looked at Elowen with an expression that was uncomfortable in the specific way of a person making genuine rather than performative amends. "You were building something, and we were laughing at you, and you were right. I should have said something." Elowen looked at her for a moment. "You stood up in there," she said. "That was late." "Late is better than not." Clara squeezed her arm once and then let go, and they stood there for a moment in the awkward way of two women who have arrived at a real understanding through difficult circumstances and are not quite sure what the ordinary version of their relationship looks like yet. "Come for water tomorrow morning if you need it," Elowen said. "We're still open." Clara nodded. She went to find her husband. She was nearly at the door when she heard her name said behind her, and she turned. Howard Beale, the county assessor, the man Calder had spoken to, the one whose concern about her claim had started this whole proceeding, was standing near the platform with his hat in his hands. He had the look of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and was not entirely sure this was it. "Mrs. Voss," he said again. She waited. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that the petition, it was filed with my office. I didn't initiate it. I had to process it and schedule the review. That's my function. I didn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I don't think I should have moved so fast on it. I could have asked questions first." She looked at him. He was not Calder. She understood that. He was a man who had done what his job required without asking whether he should have asked harder questions first, and who was now standing in a room telling her so because his conscience was apparently more active than his initial response had suggested. "Why didn't you ask questions?" she said. Not confrontationally, just the question. He was quiet for a moment. "Calder's been in the county a long time," he said. His word carries weight. "I should have—" He stopped. "I should have gone out and looked at the land myself before I scheduled anything." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." He nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting something rather than just hearing it. "If you need anything from the land records office," he said, "going forward, anything at all." "I'll come to you directly," she said. He put his hat on and went out. Outside, in the ordinary August heat of the Ashwater Crossing Main Street, the light was flat and white, and the dust was already rising from the road. Tobin and Maisie were at the wagon, Maisie sitting on the bench with her hat in her lap and her face turned up toward the sky, and Tobin standing beside the horse with his hand on the animal's neck in the way he did when he was managing his own feelings and found that something to touch was useful. Elowen walked to the wagon and stood there for a moment, not getting in. She looked up the main street, at the buildings she'd driven past the first day she arrived. The feed store, Pell's Hardware, the dry goods at the back of the building she'd just come out of. The places where words had moved about her, through the spring and the summer, carried from person to person with a specific quality of amusement. It didn't feel like victory. She'd been braced for it to feel like victory, and it didn't, which was a surprise. It felt like continuation, like the moment after a crisis where the crisis is over and the ordinary requirements of the day reassert themselves, and you realize that the world does not pause to mark what just happened, but simply goes on expecting you to function in it. She had to go home and check the trench. She had to check the corn's progress in the eastern rows, where she'd been worried about a dry stretch affecting the ears. She had to look at the beans that had come back from the edge in July and determine whether they were going to make it fully or only partially and plan accordingly. She had a farm to run. She got in the wagon. Tobin got in beside her. Maisie climbed over him, which was her preferred method of reaching her spot on the bench regardless of how inconvenient it was for Tobin, and settled herself and put her hat back on. "Are we going home?" Maisie asked. "Yes," Elowen said. She picked up the reins. "Mama," Maisie said. That man in the good coat." Maisie meant Holt, the attorney. "He kept making that face." "What face?" "Like when you eat something sour, but you don't want anyone to know you're eating something sour." Tobin made a sound that was almost a laugh. Elowen felt something release in her chest. Not the tightness from before, something different, something lighter. "Yes," she said. "He did make that face a lot." She turned the horse toward the east road. They passed the Prewitt farm on the way home, as they always did. Harlan Prewitt was in the yard. He saw them coming and he didn't look away, and as they drew level with his gate he raised his hand, not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, the kind of gesture a man makes when he wants to say something but doesn't have the right words yet, and knows it, and does what he can. Elowen nodded. She drove on. The trench looked the same as it always looked, which was both unremarkable and, to Elowen, inexhaustibly meaningful. The berm standing along its full length, the curve of it across the field's contour, the spillway at the lower end. The deep section, where the cold seep continued its patient work. The soil around the near end of the trench darker than the soil at the field's far edge. Darker, meaning wetter. Wetter, meaning alive. She stood at the head of the trench for a long time. Tobin came up beside her. Maisie had gone directly to the barn to see the horse settled. This was her responsibility, one she'd taken on without being asked, and she took it seriously in a way that expressed itself as total focus on the horse and no patience for anything that interfered with it. "What are you thinking?" Tobin asked. "I'm thinking about the corn," she said. "The east rows. I want to check the ears this afternoon." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not what you're thinking about," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the trench, not at her, with an expression she recognized. The one he wore when he'd decided to say something he wasn't entirely certain he should say. "I'm thinking that this was harder than I thought it would be," she said, "and that it's not done. The harvest isn't finished, and the tax is still coming in November, and there's still more to do than I have hours in the day. And I'm thinking—" She paused. "I'm thinking about your father, about how he would have liked today." Tobin was quiet. She had not talked about Clement in some time. Not directly, not like this. She was careful with it, because grief in families had a way of becoming something everyone managed alone to protect everyone else. And she'd been aware of that pattern and trying not to let it become permanent. "He would have," Tobin said, finally. "He was the one who kept the journal," she said, "his grandfather's journal. He could have left it in Iowa. He put it in the trunk, and he brought it." She looked at the trench. "I don't know if he knew why, but he brought it." They stood there together for a moment in the afternoon heat, looking at the things she had made from knowledge she'd found in a trunk he had carried across 3 states for reasons neither of them had understood at the time. Then Elowen straightened. "Go get the measuring stick," she said. "I want the water level before dark." "Already wrote this morning's," Tobin said. "Write this afternoon's too," she said. "I want a full day's record." He went to get the measuring stick. She walked to the deep section of the trench and crouched beside the pool. She pressed her fingers into the cold water, still cold, still steady, still seeping from the south face of the trench at the same slow, faithful rate. She'd stopped being surprised by it, which she recognized as a thing that happened when something went from being a hope to being a fact. She straightened up. The sun was moving west. There were things to do before dark. There always were. And the fact that she'd spent the morning in a hearing room instead of the field meant those things were still waiting for her with the patient urgency of things that didn't care what else had been happening in your life. She went to do them. And the trench did what it had been doing since the day the first storm came and the first water gathered in its curve and found its way down through the clay toward something that had been waiting a long time to be found. It held what it was given and let it sink in slowly and turned it into something the land could use. The harvest took 3 weeks. It was not a triumphant harvest. She needed to be honest about that, because she had spent enough of her life watching people make things sound cleaner than they were, and she had no intention of doing it to herself. The corn came in short. The ears were smaller than what she'd hoped for, and 2 rows on the north end of the field, the ones she'd worried about since July, gave her about half what she'd planted. She pulled those stalks herself, early on a cool morning, and she stood there looking at what she had and did the arithmetic the way she'd done it that first night in the cabin, plainly, without flinching from the numbers. It was enough. Not comfortable. Not plentiful. But enough to pay the November tax, enough to put seed money aside for spring, enough to get through the winter if she was careful, which she was always careful, which was no longer something she had to remind herself to be. The sorghum was the real story. The sorghum had done what she'd planted it to do. It had survived the worst of July on the moisture the trench held, and when August brought the slight temperature drop and the underground seep had been steadily building the soil's reserves for 2 months, the sorghum had responded in a way that surprised even her. She ended up with more than she'd budgeted for, enough to sell a portion at the Ashwater Crossing grain buyers, a quiet man named Peters, who weighed it without comment and handed her money that was real and solid in her palm. She stood outside his building holding that money for a moment before she put it in her coat pocket. It was the first money she had made from this land. She went home and put it in the tin box in the kitchen shelf, and she did not make a ceremony of it, but she stood there with her hand on the shelf for a moment before she went to make supper. The first neighbor dug in September. It was Martin Delacroix, the boy's father, a quiet, wide-shouldered man she'd spoken to perhaps 4 times total, who appeared at her gate on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized as the expression of someone who has been working up to a question for longer than they want to admit. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Come in," she said. She meant through the gate, but he shook his head. "This'll just take a minute. Your trench." He looked toward the field. "You did the planning yourself. The curves, the angle of it." "Yes." "Using a level." "And the family journal." "The principle came from there. The specific application I worked out by walking the land." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "My land has a different slope than yours, north-facing mostly, and the runoff pattern goes east." "You'd need to trace the contour lines first," she said. "Walk it after a rain if you can, and watch where the water naturally wants to go. You want to intercept it before it leaves your property, not after." She paused. "I could come look at it, if you want. Not today. I've got the last of the beans to bring in. But next week." He looked at her. "I'd pay you for your time." "You brought your son to fill barrels in a drought," she said. "We can call it even." He put his hat back on. He was not a man who showed much in his face, but something shifted there. Not sentimentality, more like relief. The kind that comes when you've been carrying something by yourself and someone finally offers to help you set it down. "Tuesday?" he said. "Tuesday," she said. "Done." She went to the Delacroix farm on Tuesday and walked the land with Martin for 2 hours, carrying the long level and a stack of wooden stakes. She showed him how to find the contour line, the method she'd developed over weeks of trial and error on her own property, which was less elegant than what Clement's grandfather had described in the journal and more practical, shaped by what she'd actually learned from doing it wrong first. She showed him where to start the curve. She showed him the angle of the berm and why it mattered. She told him about the breach in her own original berm and what she'd done wrong and what she'd done differently the second time, because there was no point in a man making the same mistake she had if she could prevent it. She did not tell him it was going to be easy. She told him it was going to be hard and slow and that there would be a point, probably around the 3rd week, where it would seem like the wrong decision and that feeling was not information. It was just fatigue. Martin listened without interrupting. When she was done, he walked the line she'd staked one more time by himself, slowly, and then he came back and said, "How long did yours take?" 9 weeks, she said, start to finish. But I was doing it alone mostly, and I made mistakes. You're starting with better information. He looked at the stakes. "I'll start Saturday," he said. She left him there and drove home. 2 weeks later, she heard from Ruthie that the Motts had started digging. By October, there were 5 trenches in various stages of construction on neighboring properties. She knew about all of them because people came to her. Not officially, not with any structure around it, just the way people in farming communities have always moved information and help around, through conversations at gates and in stores and on the road between properties. She went to look at 2 of them when asked, offered corrections on one where the berm angle was going to cause problems, suggested a spillway adjustment on another. She was not an engineer. She said that plainly every time. She was a woman who had done this once and made most of the mistakes available to be made, and what she could offer was the specific knowledge that came from that. It was, she realized, the most useful thing she had ever done. Not the trench itself, though the trench was part of it. The useful thing was that she'd failed in specific ways and learned from them and was now able to prevent other people from failing in the same ways. The knowledge had a trajectory. From Clement's grandfather to the journal to Elowen, to Sella Wren's clarifying instruction to the actual ground under her feet, to the neighbors who were now cutting curves into their own slopes. It was not her knowledge originally, and it would not stay with her. It was moving. She thought about this while she did the autumn work, the winterizing of the cabin, the preparation of the seed she was saving for spring, the repairs to the barn roof that she'd been managing around since she arrived, and could now address properly because she had both the time and the money to buy what she needed. She thought about how information moved through necessity, how people who might not have listened in April had listened in September because the conditions had changed, because the drought had made the abstract concrete and the unconventional obvious. People weren't stupid, she'd decided. They were busy and risk-averse, and they trusted what had worked before, and those were all understandable qualities. What changed them wasn't argument. What changed them was evidence. You had to make the thing and show them what it did, and then they would learn it. You had to dig the trench first. Calder sent a man in October. Not himself. One of his ranch hands, a middle-aged man named Sorensen, who had always seemed to Elowen like someone slightly too decent for the work he was employed in. Sorensen came to the gate with his hat off before he even called out, which told her something about what he'd been sent to say. She came to the gate. "Mr. Calder wanted me to convey something," Sorensen said. He had the look of a man delivering a message he'd rather not deliver, which made her think it was at least intended as a conciliatory message. "Go ahead," she said. He said... Sorensen stopped, tried again. He said he has 2 properties on the South Range where the water situation is bad. He'd like to discuss whether there's any arrangement possible for technical assistance with the earthwork. She looked at Sorensen. "He wants advice," she said, "on building a trench." Sorensen's expression confirmed it without his saying it. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about Calder on his expensive horse, laughing with 3 men. She thought about Howard Beale's office and the formal petition and Holt's careful legal argument. She thought about the morning of the hearing, waking at 4:30, the notebook on the table. She thought about the families who had come through her gate with their barrels and their exhausted children. She thought about the fact that Calder's cattle had not been the priority, and were still not the priority, but that Calder's South Range properties were likely worked by people who were not Calder, tenant families, hired workers, people who had not had anything to do with the petition or the post office or the laughter. "Tell him to come himself," she said. "No attorneys, no ranch hands for show. Him." Sorensen blinked. "I'll tell him," he said. "And tell him it's not an arrangement," she said. "I'll show him what I know, same as I've shown everyone else. No charge and no special terms." Sorensen looked at her for a moment, and she saw something in his face that was not what she'd expected, a kind of private acknowledgement, almost relieved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put his hat back on and went. Calder came on a Thursday. He came alone, which she had not entirely been sure he would do, and he came on a horse that was somewhat less theatrical than the one he'd arrived on in the spring, and he came at the time she'd told Sorensen to tell him, which was 7 in the morning before the day got busy. He waited at the gate, which was new. She opened it. He was different in some way. She was still calibrating as he walked the land beside her. Not changed, exactly. He was still the same broad-shouldered, certain man, still the kind of person who occupied space with the ease of someone who'd never had to fight for it. But the certainty had a slightly different quality than it had in spring. It had been tested, she supposed, by a summer that hadn't gone his way, by wells that didn't recover as fast as expected, by cattle that had needed more management than anticipated. Difficulty had a way of adjusting certainty, not removing it but making it slightly more accurate. She showed him the trench. She explained it the same way she'd explained it to Martin Delacroix, to the Motts, to the others who had come. The contour principle, the curve and berm, the spillway, the patience required in the berm construction. The importance of building it right the first time because rebuilding in a storm at 1 in the morning was not an experience she recommended. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both of them practical and specific, and she answered them. They walked back to the gate without speaking much, which was a different kind of silence than any they'd had before. Not hostile, not performative, just 2 people who had said what needed to be said and didn't have anything to add. At the gate, he stopped. "Mrs. Voss," he said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through something, and she recognized the particular effort of a man trying to say a thing that required him to acknowledge something he'd rather not acknowledge. She didn't hurry him. She'd waited for worse things. "I was wrong about the trench," he said. He said it with the flatness of someone getting a thing over with. I thought you were..." He stopped, started differently. "I underestimated what you were doing." She looked at him. "You also tried to take my land," she said. "Yes." No argument, no qualification. "You won't try again," she said, not a question. "No," he said. She opened the gate. "The key principle is the contour line," she said. "Walk your South Range after the next rain. Watch the water move. Start the trench where the slope gives you the most interception before runoff leaves your property. Get the berm right before you count on it." She paused. "And don't rush the packing. That was my first mistake." He nodded. He rode away. She watched him go, and she felt, not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied she'd been carrying something she was now setting down. And she wasn't sure that was the right description of what she'd been carrying. What she felt was closer to the closed book feeling, the sense of a chapter that is over, not because it wasn't real or didn't matter, but because the story has moved past it, and there are other things ahead that require your attention more urgently. She turned back to her property. The autumn rains came in November, 3 weeks before the tax was due. They came the way good things sometimes come after hard things. Without fanfare, without drama, just the gray sky finally meaning what it had been promising for months. The rain coming down in the long, steady way of fall, rather than the violent bursts of summer storms. It rained for 4 days. She stood at the window of the cabin on the first morning and watched it come down. And she did not feel the anxious watching of spring and summer, the constant calculation of what this rain meant and whether it was enough and what would happen if it stopped. She felt instead a kind of deep structural relief, the relief of a house settling on its foundation, not dramatic but thorough. The trench filled overnight. She went out on the second morning in her coat and boots to check it, and the pool in the deep section had risen to its highest level since the early summer storm that had taught her about the berm, and the spillway was doing exactly what she'd built it to do, conducting the overflow in a controlled arc down the slight grade toward the fence line, spreading it slowly rather than concentrating it into anything that could damage. The berm held. Every section of it held. She stood at the edge of the trench and let the rain fall on her without moving for a few minutes. Maisie appeared at her elbow in her coat with the hood pulled up, which she had put on wrong and which listed significantly to the left. "It's working," Maisie announced. "Yes," Elowen said. "The spillway's working." "Yes." "Tobin said he needs to write it all down, but it's raining." "Tell him to write it from the barn doorway," Elowen said. "He can see the trench from there." Maisie went back to tell Tobin. Elowen stood in the rain a moment longer. She thought about the spring, about arriving on a Tuesday that nobody would have remembered, driving through the middle of town without stopping, following directions written on a folded piece of paper toward a piece of ground that had looked on first sight like a comprehensive argument for turning around. She thought about the first swing of the mattock and the flat crack it made against baked clay. She thought about the blisters that tore and the nights she'd lain awake with her shoulders aching and the morning she'd gone back out because the arithmetic allowed no other option. She thought about Tobin in the storm at 1 in the morning, holding a hammer, asking where she needed him. She thought about Maisie with her pebble game and her badly adjusted hood, and her absolute certainty that any task she'd decided was her responsibility was her responsibility. She thought about Sella Wren saying, "You're not missing water, you're letting water leave," which was the most useful single sentence anyone had said to her in the last 2 years. She thought about Clement and his grandfather and the green cloth journal and the 40 years between when it was written and when she'd needed it, and the chain of small decisions that had put it in her hands at exactly the right moment. She did not believe in meaningful coincidence, had always been skeptical of the idea that things happened for reasons. But she believed in the accumulation of careful choices made by people who paid attention, and she believed that this journal was the result of exactly that kind of accumulation, and that what she owed it was to keep the chain going. She went inside and got dry. She paid the property tax on a Monday in late November in Howard Beale's office, which was also the land records office, and also the back of the post office. Beale processed it without comment, which was all she'd wanted from him. She walked out with the receipt in her pocket. The land was hers, not provisionally, not pending, not subject to Bram Calder's opinion or Howard Beale's schedule or Judge Cray's ruling. Hers, in the solid, specific way that a thing becomes yours after you have fought for it, with your hands and your planning and your children beside you in the rain. On the way out of town, she stopped at Pell's hardware store. George Pell, who had watched her load 2 shovels and a mattock into her wagon in the early spring, with a curious expression he'd apparently turned into a story, was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in. She needed a new measuring rod. The one she'd been using since spring had cracked along one section, and she'd been working around it, which was neither accurate nor ideal. "Measuring rod," she said. "Good hardwood. I need it to handle moisture without warping." Pell found her what she needed. He wrapped it. While she was paying, he said, "Heard from Peters that you sold a good portion of sorghum this fall." "Some," she said. "Good harvest, considering." "Considering the circumstances," she agreed. "Yes." He handed her the change. She took it. For what it's worth, he said, and he said it quickly, like a man who had prepared something and was getting it out before he reconsidered. What you did with that trench. People talk about it different now than they did in the spring. She looked at him. He wasn't a complicated man, George Pell. He wasn't cruel and he wasn't generous. He was a man who ran a store and observed things and said what he saw, sometimes too late, but said it eventually. Thank you, George, she said. She picked up the measuring rod and went out. Spring came early the second year. The winter had been long and cold in the way Nebraska winters were long and cold, relentlessly, without apology, with the occasional stunning beauty of a blizzard that covered everything in white and then blew through and left the sky blue enough to ache. She and the children had managed it the way people managed things. One day at a time, with firewood and wool socks and the particular indoor projects that winter made possible. Repair work, reading, the ongoing maintenance of the old journal, which Maisie had appointed herself to reread and which she was apparently treating as an instruction manual. Maisie had also begun adding to it. This had started without Elowen's knowledge. She'd discovered it on a December evening when Maisie brought her the journal open to a new page, the first new entry after the 40-year gap, written in Maisie's large, slightly uneven 7-year-old handwriting. The date, the weather, and a drawing of the trench with measurements labeled, which were not precise but were recognizably based on Tobin's records. Elowen had looked at it for a long time. It needs to go somewhere, Maisie said, with the conviction of someone who has thought about this thoroughly. After us, I mean, so the next person has it. Elowen looked at her daughter, who was 7 years old and already thinking about after us. You're right, she said. It does. She handed the journal back. Maisie turned to the next blank page and began writing the weather conditions for that day. When the ground thawed enough to work, Elowen went out with the measuring rod and walked the west side of the property, the side she hadn't touched the first year, which had a different character than the east field, a slightly steeper slope and a different drainage pattern. She had been thinking about it all winter. The east field's trench had changed what was possible on that side. The question was whether the same principle applied on the west, and if so, what adjustments the different terrain required. She walked it for 2 days, staking and restaking, working out the contour lines, thinking about where the runoff from a heavy storm would go and where to intercept it. Tobin walked it with her on the second day, notebook in hand, measuring distances between her stakes and recording them without being asked. He had grown over the winter, not dramatically, but she could see it in the way his coat no longer quite fit at the wrists. You're thinking a second trench, he said. It was not a question. A shorter one, she said. The slope's different. I don't need the same length. Different spillway placement, too, he said, looking at the land. The drainage here runs toward the northwest. You'd want the overflow to go that direction, not east. She looked at him. He was 12 now. He had been keeping precise records for almost a year. He had stood in a thunderstorm at 1 a.m. driving stakes, and he had tabbed his water log with a piece of red ribbon, and he had carried that notebook into a county hearing room and set it on a judge's table without anyone asking him to. Yes, she said. You're right, northwest. He wrote it down. Can I help plan it? He said. Not the digging. He was asking about the planning, the measurement, the decisions about where the curve would run and how deep. You already are, she said. He looked at what he'd written. He turned back a few pages and looked at the records from the previous year, the original stakes, the measurements, the adjustments after the breach. Last year we started the curve too close to the fence, he said. We had to correct it in the 3rd week. If we start further in this time, 40 feet from the property line, she said. I've been thinking 60. 60 gives more room for the berm spread, he said. He wrote 60. I'll measure it out tomorrow morning. She nodded. They walked back to the cabin together in the early spring light, and she thought about Martin Delacroix starting his trench the previous September, and the Motts, and the 4 other properties that had broken ground in autumn with varying degrees of success. She thought about the knowledge moving, from the journal to her hands to the neighbor's hands, changing slightly with each translation because each piece of land was different and each person learned from different mistakes. She thought about Maisie adding to the journal. The knowledge was going somewhere. That was the thing she hadn't understood in the beginning, when she'd been focused entirely on survival, on whether the trench would work, on whether the crop would live, on whether she could pay the tax in November. She'd been thinking about her land, her children, her survival, and those were the right things to think about. But the trench had become something larger than what she'd built it to be. She had not intended to change how Ashwater Crossing farmed. She had intended to not lose her land. But sometimes, not always, not reliably, not as a principle you could count on, the thing you do to survive is also the thing that matters beyond your own survival. Sometimes the ditch you dig for yourself turns out to be the ditch everyone needed. You can't know that in advance. You dig it anyway. In the summer of the second year, the rains were better. Not generous, not the kind of summer that made farming easy, but better. Normal, almost. The kind of weather that, in a normal year on conventional farmed ground, would have been fine. But the farms in Ashwater Crossing were not all conventional anymore. Across the east fields, across the south range, across the north-facing slope of the Delacroix property where Martin had built his trench with the adjustments she'd suggested, the curved earthworks held their moisture, the berms stood, the spillways conducted the overflow, and beneath the surface, in the layers of soil that had spent a summer and an autumn absorbing what the trenches delivered to them, something had changed in how the land held what it was given. The drought of the previous year had not repeated, but everyone who had built a trench was ready if it did. That readiness was not a small thing. Elowen knew it was not a small thing because she had lived the year before it existed, when the readiness wasn't there, and she remembered what that felt like. The particular vulnerability of depending entirely on what fell from the sky, with no capacity to hold it, no capacity to say, even if it doesn't rain for 4 weeks, we have what we stored. She did not take the second year's relative ease as evidence that the previous year had been an aberration. She took it as breathing room. She used the breathing room to extend the west trench, to improve the spillway on the east side, to walk the remaining unworked sections of the property and think about what else was possible. She used it to sleep better, which was not a small thing either. She went to see Sela Wren in August of the second year. She went partly to tell her how things had developed, because Sela had earned that information and Elowen believed in paying what you owed. She went partly for another reason that was harder to name, a desire to sit with someone who had given her something crucial and to acknowledge it properly, which was different from thanking a person and more personal than it. Sela was in her garden. She was always in her garden. Elowen was starting to believe the woman slept there. She sat on the silver-gray bench and told Sela what had happened. The harvest, the hearing, the winter, the spring planting, the second trench, the neighbors who were building their own versions of it across the county. Sela listened in the way she listened, which was with her whole attention and no interruption. When Elowen finished, Sela said, "And the children?" "Tobin's helping plan the second trench. He's better at reading the contour than I am, honestly. He sees it faster." She paused. "Maisie is writing in the journal." Sela looked at her. "The family journal," Elowen said, "the one with the original trench description. Maisie decided it needed to keep going. She's been adding entries since December." Sela was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "Just that." They sat in the garden for a while, not saying much. The late summer afternoon moved around them. Insects, the dry smell of the grass beyond the garden, the warmth that was not the killing warmth of the previous July, but just warmth, the ordinary kind. "You told me to pay attention to the sky," Elowen said after a while. "I did. It was the right thing to tell me." "You were looking in the wrong direction," Sela said. "Sometimes that's all someone needs to hear." Elowen thought about that. "I was looking for what was missing," she said. "Water that wasn't there. Money I didn't have, a well I couldn't afford. I was looking at the gaps. And the water wasn't missing, it was leaving." She looked at the old woman. "That was the whole thing, wasn't it? The whole change. Stopping looking for what wasn't there and starting to see what was there and leaving." Sela smiled. A real one this time. Not the small private movement from before, but a full smile. The kind that reorganized her entire weathered face. "You figured it out," she said. "I just pointed you. The original trench is still there." Years later, after the cabin's sagging roof became a sound one, after the Eastfield soil changed in character as the sustained moisture worked its way through the clay and left something richer behind, after Tobin's notebooks filled a shelf, and Maisie's journal editions grew from a child's large handwriting to something more practiced and precise, The trench is still there, running its curve across the contour of the east field. During heavy rain, water gathers in it the way it always has, slowing, spreading, soaking in. The pool in the deep section still seeps cold in summer. The berm, repaired twice more over the years when particularly aggressive storms tested it, stands solid. The spillway works. But the thing that matters most about the trench is not the trench itself. It is what happened after it. Across the neighboring farms, the curves cut into other slopes by other hands tell the story better than any account of Elowen Voss individually, because Elowen Voss individually is not the story's point. She is its beginning. The point is what she proved, and what that proof made possible, and what people did with it once they had seen it done. People do not change because they are argued with. People change because they see something that works, and they are practical enough to want what works for themselves, and they have the sense to learn from whoever learned it first. She had learned it first because she had no choice. That is perhaps the most human thing about the whole story, that necessity produced the knowledge, and the knowledge outlasted the necessity, and the ditch that everyone mocked became the technique that the community built its resilience on. Not because Elowen Voss was exceptional. She was not exceptional. She was a woman who needed water and found a way to make the land hold it, and she made mistakes and learned from them and kept going because there was no alternative to keeping going. That is not exceptional. That is the human minimum. But the human minimum, applied with full force, is more than enough. She knows this now. She knew it by the end of the first summer, though she didn't have words for it then. She knows it differently now, from the vantage of years of seasons and harvests, and the ongoing daily work of a farm that is alive, truly alive, on land that once looked like it was trying to explain to her why she should leave. She didn't leave. She dug. And the land eventually let her in.